while we're getting this teed up, first of all, I want to say, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this great panel, and thanks to all of you who are here. And we look forward to spending a little bit of time with you today. I did have the opportunity previously to represent and advise Representative Grusendorf when he was on the State Board of Education, when Rob Eissler was on the Conroe ISD Board. Had the opportunity to work with him and advise him for many years. Have great appreciation, obviously, for their service and for the many years they've spent. And Justice Enoch and I have gotten to know each other over the years professionally, and particularly during the course of this lawsuit. And Justice, it's been great to get to know you even better during the course of this litigation. This round of the litigation was probably the longest from a trial standpoint. The record was the most extensive of any of the cases. The Travis County District Clerk's record was just filed with the Supreme Court finally early this week. The state promptly the next day filed their statement of jurisdiction with the court. We expect the Supreme Court at some time in the next few weeks to note probable jurisdiction, and we have also submitted, as part of the state's statement of jurisdiction, submitted a proposed briefing schedule that all of the parties have discussed and have reached general agreement on. And that briefing schedule will basically consume, Justice Enoch, I think, most of the spring with the back and forth briefing. Last time we had the oral argument the first week of July. I think it's going to be difficult this time to have the oral argument prior to the August recess, just looking at the briefing schedule this time, but I expect we'll hear more from the Supreme Court sometime in the next few weeks about how they wish to proceed on that. Just very quickly to kind of set the stage, and many of you have seen this, but I want to just couch a couple of remarks by looking at what our Constitution actually says. Article 7, Section 1 of our state Constitution has been with us unchanged since 1876. And it's a pretty extraordinary statement, and it's very consistent with similar statements in constitutions in other states. But I want you to look at it for just a moment. A general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people, comma. That first phrase is the why. That is why we have public schools in Texas. That notion, that sort of Jeffersonian notion that there is a linkage between an educated citizenry and a healthy society or healthy democracy is embedded in our Constitution. That's the why. Everything after the comma is the how. It shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. And that language about duty, by the way, is fairly unique in our Constitution. There are many public services that we all use, we all appreciate. I'm glad we have them. But this language about duty is relatively unique in our legislature, and again, in our Constitution, and again, this language has been unchanged since 1876. The language in red tends to be the parts of this phrase that we wind up arguing about in the courts. What does that mean? What are the boundaries, and what's the actual detail, the legal obligation that flows, and again, that tends to focus on those phrases that are in red. Second provision of our Constitution is Article 8, Section 1E. It's of much more recent origin. Many of you may know, you may not know. We actually had a state property tax in Texas for most of our state's existence. And we actually had litigation in the 60s and 70s over our state property tax, primarily because of unequal valuation practices between jurisdictions, differences in collection practices. And when we begin to modernize and standardize appraisal practices in the late 70s, early 80s, we actually adopted a provision of our Constitution prohibiting a state property tax. So these are kind of the two provisions that we wind up arguing about in our Constitution. The first, and in broad terms, the Article 7 provision is referred to as the Education Clause. That was the primary focus of the litigation all through the Edgewood 1, 2, 3, and 4. The property tax clause or prohibition, Article 8.1e, has been the focus of the West Orange Cove litigation, and both of these provisions are currently very much at issue in the current litigation. The ruling by the trial court in the current case is the broadest ruling we've had from the trial court ever in any of the school finance lawsuits going back to Edgewood 1. The court did find that we've backed into a state property tax, and by the way, our Supreme Court has said multiple times, I think Justice Cornyn, now Senator Cornyn, wrote most extensively on this when he was on the bench. Something Tamara and I have always told our daughters, it's possible to do indirectly what you're prohibited from doing directly. You know what I mean? And so our Supreme Court's always said, if we create a system that is literally so dependent on local property taxes for its primary support, that functionally it looks like the state is controlling and spending or directing the expenditure of the local property tax. If it looks and operates like a state tax, we're going to call it a state tax. So that's sort of the issue there. Judge Deeds found we had backed into a state property tax. He found the system is inadequate. That's one of the issues that really surfaced for the first time in a fully fleshed out form in Edgewood, in the West Orange Cove lawsuit. He found we're not making suitable provision because the court's language has been that the system has to be structured, operated, and funded to achieve the goal of general diffusion of knowledge, and he also found that it's not equitable. A couple of very quick slides I want you to look at. This one goes to the state property tax claim, which the court did find the system in violation of in 2005. I frankly think this is almost low-hanging fruit. And I think as we go to the Supreme Court again, the evidence is fairly compelling on this. If we look at what we did in 2013, if you add up everything that it looks like we restored to public education of the cuts from 2011 plus paying for growth, it looks like we put $6.2 billion back into public education. Everybody see that number, 6.22? Look at the next column over. The state out of general revenue only spent $2 billion. How did that happen? How did we restore $6.2 billion but only spend $2 billion? Look at the next column over at the top. We relied on the local property tax growth to pay for the overwhelming majority of what we nominally are taking credit for at the state level in terms of state expenditures. And in fact, in 2013, the legislature appropriated roughly $800 million of state money out of that $2 billion that's never going to see a single classroom, a single student, or a single teacher. It's not going to be spent. It's going to lapse back into general revenue simply because property values increase. The reality is we have a system that is overwhelmingly dependent on local property taxes, and local property tax growth is treated by the state as if it were state revenue. So that's going to be one of the issues. If we look at the sworn testimony, you can see the funding on a per student basis over roughly a biennium. You'll see that we sort of hit our high water mark in 2009, and by the way, we hit that high water mark because of the one-time federal ARRA money. But if you'll look in 2015, we're still several $100s below where we were in 2004, and of course our population has grown and changed over that period of time. This is a slide that I think goes to the heart of some of the issues. Our population in Texas, our student population, we're growing by about 85 to 88,000 students a year. We are adding a Fort Worth ISD every year to the state of Texas. And those kids are overwhelmingly coming from low-income backgrounds. Texas is now a majority minority state, and 61% of our children come from homes that qualify for free and reduced price lunch. That percentage is increasing by about 0.5% a year. Socioeconomic status correlates. I don't want to say a causal relationship, but there's a correlation to educational performance that's more closely linked to socioeconomic status than any other single factor. Go to the College Board website, look at SAT data disaggregated by family income. It is a hard, statistically significant straight line. Why? Because you're looking at the proxy for educational level of the parents, particularly educational level of the mother, and you're looking at a proxy for stability in the home. So, what this slide shows is we have a compounding issue in Texas as the percentage of low-income kids increases in a district. You begin to see a compounding of the performance issues in that district, not only for the low-income kids, but actually for the non-low-income kids. So the question is, do we have a system that actually reflects our current requirements, our current student populations, and the needs of our different student populations? The answer, I think, frankly, it's hard to argue with, is pretty solidly no. If you look at our formulas in Texas, in spite of a very clear statutory mandate, we haven't updated our formulas. We haven't even examined our formulas in years. We have formulas that the last time we even looked at them, the Berlin Wall was standing, Ronald Reagan was president, and Merle Haggard had the #1 song. And we haven't even examined them since then. We've had a lot of changes since then. You'll note that the evidence in trial presented that we're probably falling somewhere in the range of at least $800 a kid. We're not talking about doubling expenditures for kids short, and this is particularly with regard to our low-income kids. Hundreds of thousands or millions of our kids are succeeding, are doing very well, but I think it's our low-income kids in particular that are struggling in our system, and frankly, that's where our formula structure has not been examined and is probably most deficient. You had the testimony presented showed that 880 districts with well over 90% of the kids at even maximum tax rates cannot reach the level needed to provide all students with the general diffusion of knowledge required by the Constitution. Roughly 73 districts could. So that's a little quick background. So Kent, and then very quickly in answer to your questions, the Supreme Court did find the system unconstitutional on the basis of the property tax, the Article 8(1)(e) claim last time. Frankly, I think the evidence on that claim is very compelling this time around. The question you ask is, the court obviously last time did not delve into the Article 7 issues. Why do I think that will be different this time? First of all, on adequacy, with regard to our low-income kids, and I want to be very careful here, I think we have many, many districts, many, many campuses, and many, many students who are being successful. The data is pretty compelling. Our low-income kids as a population are struggling and are not making progress, and the Supreme Court, Kent, in Edgewood, in West Orange Cove, I think put a lot of weight on the fact that there did still seem to be some evidence of progress in the system. The trial court in West Orange Cove did not find the system inequitable, and I want to correct you on that. The trial court found the system inequitable as to facilities, but not as to programmatic operations. I think the Supreme Court said we're not going to try the constitutionality of the system on a program-by-program basis. It's more of a systemic question, and I think that primarily was their basis for reversing the trial court last time, and I'm not going to disagree with that analysis. This time around, I think equity is an interesting issue. I think if it's presented to the court as a a question of you can only increase the equity of the system by leveling the system down. If the only approach appears to take the Highland Parks and the high-performing districts and simply pull them down, I think the court's going to be resistant to re-engage on the equity issue, Kent, and I think it'll depend on how that issue is briefed and presented to the court this time around. I think the suitability issue, and the Supreme Court has said that goes to the structure, the operation, and the funding level, I think is actually going to be a more significant issue this time around than it has been in the prior rounds. But I do think the Article 8 tax issue is pretty straightforward, and I think the real question for the court this time around is whether the court is ready to re-engage on any of the Article 7 education clause issues.
Thank you, David.
So I'll stop with that. And I hope I didn't overextend my time.
Very briefly, Justice Enoch, you have maybe a 1-minute response to anything David said?
Very quickly.
Before we get into your presentation.
I was going to ask that. Okay, 1 minute. I'm watching very carefully with you. Maybe 3 points that I'd like to make. There was no evidence in this case of how much it costs to educate a child in Texas. Second point, the judge in his first comments about the judgment in this case was, well, I declared it unconstitutional the last time because he sat on the West Orange Cove 2 case because funding was inadequate. I realize the Supreme Court reversed me, but we have more kids this time and less money this time, so it must be unconstitutional. That's the judge's ruling. Now, we're going to have pages and pages and pages of findings of fact and conclusions of law in this case. But the bottom line is, I don't believe the legislature wants to know how much it costs to educate a child for fear it may be more than what they allocate. And the ISDs don't want to know how much it costs to educate a child because they're scared it'll be less. And my final point is, to answer these questions, I believe the Supreme Court will do the same thing as it's done in the past. We do have this Article 8, which just says that the state can't have a statewide property income tax. I think the evidence will show that through the funding formulas that the legislature has imposed, it has effectively created everybody having to tax at the same level. So I think they'll do that again. But I don't believe the Supreme Court wants to get into the business of saying what has been allocated for education is inadequate for a general diffusion of knowledge. My final point will be, the evidence in this case will show that when courts try to deal with general diffusion of knowledge, they look to what the legislature said is how we determine that. How do we determine that? By testing the students. Over 40 years of school finance, what has happened? The courts are in a morass. They can't really get out of school litigation, and it's in a number of states, not just Texas. And what has happened? They start identifying what the state says the level of education ought to be. They compare funding to that, and what happens? The state reduces the educational requirements. Last legislative session, what was the issue? We're testing our students too much. Well, by golly, let's get rid of some of the testing. What happens when the courts meddle in financing on school education without actually knowing what it takes to educate a child? You end up with the legislature actually reducing expectations for the kids who graduate from the system. And you have courts who keep insisting, well, we've got to have more funding because we don't know what else to do.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judge.
Chairman Eissler, try to see if you can hold to the time limit.
Yes, sir, I will. I'll do it, and I'll do it quickly. And I can tell you just from experience, by the way, it was the Blue Angels picked the other guy because they didn't think I was serious enough. I know for those of you who know me. True story. Anyway, we don't know what it costs to educate a student, but we sure know what we spend. And I'll make those points on my 12 minutes, Randy, and I won't go over it. And I probably have 30 seconds left. Rick Perry said, one of my favorite quotes of Rick Perry said, we'll give more dollars for education when we can get more education for our dollars. That's the efficiency part. That was my favorite quote from Rick Perry, except for that third agency. And I can't remember which one it was either. I think it was the Department of Education. Anyway, one quick response is the finance should be simpler, and I know, how am I doing, Randy? How much more time? 10 seconds. If we can make it simple and everybody understand it, it would be a lot easier. I think there's a reason why it's complicated. And if you've been at it long enough, it's not that complicated, and I'll show you.
You'll get another chance
Yes,
to the
sir.
microphone.
Yes, sir.
Everybody
Thank
gets
you.
another shot. Justice Enoch, as a former member of the Texas Supreme Court, who sat on that court and looked at the school finance trials before, and how does this trial, or how does this case differ from other trials? And I know you're going to talk about the efficiency issue, which is what you're litigating. But Judge Deitch ruled against us on the efficiency issue. Why would the Texas Supreme Court rule any different where he considered it a political issue?
So how much time do I have left of my time since I went over a minute? But anyway,
Don't worry about it. We'll make something work.
we'll make it work.
I'm just harassing everybody.
That's great. Okay.
That's how I make my living.
David Thompson has already introduced you to the constitutional provision that governs this litigation that's going on. And the Supreme Court has said that there are standards in that provision that got the courts involved in litigating the question. And the court decided it was not a political question, and so they've moved forward in that. So we've talked about a general diffusion of knowledge. That's the constitutional objective. We've talked about the duty of the legislature. That's the constitutional obligation. And then we talked about what the standard is, a suitable provision for support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. Now, the Texas Supreme Court, in looking at that provision, did a couple of things. One, it says it's an efficient system. So what does efficiency mean? Well, it means productive of results with little waste. It says, well, what is going on with kind of a suitable provision? Well, it's a qualitative component. It explicitly says a general diffusion of knowledge and suitable provision. There's a qualitative component to that. And then through a series of litigation, it comes in and recognizes that a part of that, not the answer to that, but a part of that is, of course, money. But through all of the litigation, there has always been one or more voices on the Supreme Court that have said money is not the only issue, nor is money the only solution, reflecting what the evidence will show, that over time, courts have found themselves in a morass of talking about funding issues, because that's kind of an easy target. Talk about low-hanging fruit. But nobody has talked seriously about the other qualitative positions until this case. Now I want to talk briefly about Eric Henushek. Eric Henushek, maybe you haven't heard of him, he is a renowned across the country economist who has studied economic factors involving public education. To save time, I won't go through his curriculum vitae, but let's just say he has chaired national boards on education and financing research, and a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, and currently serves as a fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Don't let your eyes glaze over. I'm going to go through these very quickly. First one, second one, third one, fourth one, fifth one, sixth one, seventh one. Okay, questions?
You ever seen an attorney do anything so quick?
What did you recognize in every one of those slides? What did you recognize? Right. Did you see a pattern? A bunch clustered, and then above and a bunch below. Did you see a line that kind of cut through the middle of that? Okay. The line cutting through the middle of that is the test scores. The line tracks funding, and the line tracks scores on the testing. There are clumps. Even the judge said, well, it looks like there's a pattern there. It is. The pattern is not related to money. Let's back up. Money goes to the right. 0 means some schools spend less per child than other schools. Some schools spend a lot more per child. Where's the pattern? It doesn't matter. You're going to have schools perform better. You're going to have schools perform less, irrespective of money. What's the response from the judge? Well, you're just saying money doesn't count. That's never what's been said. That's never what's been said. That is also adjusted for economically disadvantaged students. It's adjusted for special education. It's adjusted for students whose natural language is not English. It is adjusted for the very factors that school districts, in this case, argue is why they need more money. Because some are poor. They have to meet more students who have special needs than students that don't. Those numbers are adjusted for those amounts. That's the issue that's different in this case. When we talk about what it takes to educate a child, the amount of money that it takes to educate a child, I am serious when I say I think the legislature is not interested in knowing how much it takes to educate a child. Yes, it's complicated, but you can figure it out because it might be more than what the legislature allocates. On the other hand, school districts certainly don't want to know how much it costs to educate a child because as long as nobody knows, they can always come in and look at that green line down there. My golly, we're having a struggle educating our kids, so we need more money. Now, not to put too fine a point on all of this, what does it say about litigation when the school districts begin the argument by saying the system is really in problems because we have to sue, we, the school district, have to sue every 6 years to get more money? The best question, hands down, if you voted in this litigation, one of the superintendents of one of the school districts is on the stand and gets asked the question, how much does it cost you, Mr. Superintendent, to educate a child in your school? He said some number, I don't remember what the number was. Next question, well, how did you calculate that? Well, I was up in my room and I took the various numbers and I pulled out my smartphone. He called it his cell phone. He started calculating it. That's the number he came up with. Best question. Is there an app for that? The state's record has been filed, and so now the briefing is beginning. I have mentioned how the judge opened his judgment, and I believe that has driven the result, which is he thought it was unconstitutional to begin with. It's bound to be unconstitutional this time for all of the reasons he said. The judge said the issue of the explicit qualitative standard that's in the Constitution, if he addresses that, well, that's a political question. But if he addresses the implicit standard, well, you've got to have sufficient money, well, that's not a political question. He can do the hard numbers on that, and he can say it's unconstitutional because there's not enough funding. In the beginning, actually, I did not agree with Kent, who had asked me to take on the responsibility of representing parents and businesses, about the fact that really you can't address efficiency in the school system unless you open up to competition. I've become a firm devotee because you look at the blue dots. You look at the blue dots here. I could not tell you why the dot, not the outlier, but the bunch, why they do so much better job. and the dots at the bottom. I could not, as a legislator, tell you what we need to tweak to make that happen. What I can tell you is what Eric Henyushek has said. You go to a school district that has competition from a charter, and you find the schools in the public sector starting to produce better. The question with charters I always see, why the charters don't do any better than the public schools. That's the wrong question. Why do charters do as well as public schools for 12% less funding? That's the question that should be asked. There are things that in this litigation we offered the judge that he said was political questions. I'll give you an example. Maria Karstoffen was the Independent School District, Austin Independent School District superintendent here. In her deposition, I said, let's just have a conversation. What did you find when you came here? She was in Washington, D.C. as a school administrator. She was in Minnesota, I guess, or Wisconsin as a school administrator. Minneapolis, Minnesota. These are not states that pattern themselves after Texas, right? What's the most surprising thing you found here? How hard it is and expensive it is to fire a teacher. As to what else, you've been innovative. What have you done? Well, I partnered with a charter school for one of the most failing schools in Austin. And she said, I partnered with them. What did you find surprising about that? The resistance. It's been allowed by the legislature for years, but no school district has ever done that. And she found that such resistance. An election of the school board of Austin. She loses her support for that election. She loses her support for that charter school. That was the basis of the election. She loses her support. The new members come in, and without even studying the issue, they say that's wrong, and they cancel the contract. That school, the charter school, moved 11 miles south, took 100% of the parents who had their students in that program, and had a 27% increase in enrollees in that charter school that she had partnered with to meet the local neighborhood's needs. I became a devotee of competition and removing state statutes that create monopolies for independent school districts. That's the claim we have. Final comment. The Supreme Court said ISDs can represent parents in the constitutional question of education, so the ISDs bring these lawsuits against the state. Understand the taxpayers pay both sides. They pay the ISDs, they pay the state side. Parents joined this as interveners. And who was the body that objected to the parents being in the lawsuit? Edgewood ISD, which was the first case that came up on school finance, did not want the parents represented in the court system.
Thank you, Justice Enoch. David, you got any comments, brief comments regarding the judge's comments?
No, I'll save the time for questions from the audience, so I'll
Any
yield.
comment or
Thanks.
response to-
Yeah, real fast.
Briefly?
Hey. Guess the only way you can be more brief is if to be in your underwear.
That's known, folks, those of you that do not know Bob Eissler, that's known as an Eissler arrest.
Anyway,
We had a rule against that when I was chairing the committee, but go ahead, Bob.
it's tough to get recognized when you have a smile on your face, right? Great analysis by the court that you all, I think, Michael and Kent put together, and it touches on this subject. Real fast, and again, this goes back to the time. By the way, have you ever seen a Supreme Court justice so animated? Huh?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Sorry. No, I think it's great. And Rick Hanushek is a top researcher. Anyway, looking at efficiency, you can do it. You can look at it by correcting for. I'm talking fast because Randy's pushing me. You can look at spending, and you can see the differences in outcomes, and I'll show you a little bit, and how much money is spent, and who is. Anybody have any idea what the most productive school district in Texas is? That means they get the most achievement, most performance of every dollar than all the others. And that's Cy-Fair. Cy-Fair has the largest homestead exemption in the state. And they are the most productive. They're the most efficient. I mean, before that, 5 years was Hearst, Euless, Bedford, and I'll get into a little bit of that. But if you look at some of the things, there's a $4,500 per student difference between the most productive and least productive of the top 200 school districts in Texas, which is 82 point something % of the kids. It's the 80-20 rule. And top 10 school districts in Texas, there's 1 million kids, but the median-sized school district is 907 kids. So you can see there's a wide range. And if we just funded the schools, the top 200 schools, by what the top quarter spent, you could save $3.5 billion a year. Now that's efficiency, okay? And I knew that. If we copied Hearst, Euless, Bedford, we'd save about $9 billion a year because they are the most productive. And that's corrected for demographics. And by the way, there is a correction for poverty in our formulas. You get 20% of a basic allotment, which has gone up twice in the last 10 years. You get 20% of that. And that's compensatory education. And English language learners, another 10%. So poverty is taken care of, and that's why we spend more on poor kids. And is that my time?
You stay right where you are. Sure, and I will pose my question to you while you're at the podium.
Oh, you want me to take my notes? Do one of those here?
If you want your notes, you can get your notes.
Well, you see, having notes keeps you shorter.
Chairman Eissler, you were chairing the education.
I'm sorry.
You were chairing the education committee during the time that the legislature cut $5 billion from public education. And that was a key component of the arguments in the litigation by the plaintiffs that those cuts were part of what made the system unconstitutional on the adequacy argument. Can you share with our audience today some of the thoughts or the legislature's thinking at that time in justifying those cuts? I think you just talked about it or hinted to it in your last comments, but also, how do you think that the pending legislation might affect this legislative session?
Okay, and in 12 minutes, I'll tell you why, although I do have a PowerPoint somewhere. Oh, there it is. Hey, you guys are good.
We handed it off to somebody that could take care of it.
Yes. So, just looking at it, and thank you for having me, and yes, these are great people, and Kent has been my mentor, and somebody told me, in fact it was Harold Dutton, said the only difference between Grusendorf and Eissler is Eissler smiles a lot more. But since Kent's been out of the legislature, he smiles a lot more, so I want you to know. Anyway, Kent's question was, how do I defend that? It's like, well, gosh, how do you defend it? There's no defense to it. That's the law. That's how much money we were projected to have, and that's how much we had to balance our budget. Unlike other places that can print money, Texas must balance its budgets constitutionally. One reason we have serial lawsuits about funding and that decisions are overturned is that we're not solving the right problem. We're not even looking at the right problem. By the way, $5 billion, I don't know how they come up with that. At first, it looked like we had to cut $10 billion in a biennium. And then that got cut down because more money was found and other things were shifted around, and the final assignment was $4 billion over a biennium. And I don't know if you remember Lloyd Doggett withholding the stimulus money for teacher pay, $800 million that finally we got. So it was really 3.2, and then Robert Scott cut $1 billion in grants. So that, if you want to say that's 4.2 billion, is a closer number. Not that I needed to get into that, but 5, I guess, is a lot easier to throw around. And those grants weren't gone to all the schools. So in terms of statewide schools affected, you're talking closer, 3.2 billion. So let's solve the right problem. We don't solve the right problem. It's all about state revenue. Well, we don't look at spending. And school districts get their money. By the way, they spend all their money, but they have other sources. You've got, as David Thompson showed, about the about local money, but the state does have a local assigned fund to it. You have state, you have local, you've got federal, all those you like free and reduced lunch. You know, for like 9% of your budget, you can get the federal government to tell you everything that you need to do. So, if you want to cut 9%, you can get the feds out of the equation. And again, there are grants. So there are 5 different, and schools spend it on really 2 places. Operations, now I say really 2 places because there's debt service for bonded indebtedness, and operations, and then they put the rest of the money into fund balance, okay? So looking at the right problem, we need to look at, and David Thompson, I thought, made a good comment, and I don't know Merle Haggard's song title, but he's right about, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two, about the difference between policies and politics, okay? Our policies are for kids, our politics is for adults. And when you come up with good policies and need to change or fix them, politics gets in the way, and I'll show you about that in a little bit. Anyway, the legislature has to look at the big picture, and you don't want to see just what, well, here it is, I think, let's see if this works, there it is, the right problem. We need to focus on spending, not revenues, and I mentioned local, state, federal, grant, and foundation are revenues. And if you really want to see what's being spent, it's not to sue the state over what the state is providing, but to see the sources of funds for schools. And we need to understand spending over time and not just one biennium. And then again, do we ever look at the impact of spending on outcomes? We haven't, okay? So, responsible legislatures, like Senator Taylor over there, have to look at what the long term is. Okay? Well, let's look at what has happened. This lawsuit is really about the dip in 2012, about what we actually did. And by the way, we had to split the Senate plan and the House plan because the Senate had more policy, and that was called target revenue, and that was their target, was to cut ASETAR. And I'll talk about that. It's additional state aid for tax reduction, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But anyway, look at the increases over the years, okay? And that's percent increase. And you see the 0 line, the arrow points to, look at this, huh? The arrow points to the cut, okay? But you look at the percentage right afterwards. And by the way, there's another 3-point-something billion coming up for next year. So the state has bounced very quickly. But look at what happened to fund balances in percent growth over that same period, in the same year. Okay? Remember, schools are spending the money they have and put the rest in the bank. Okay, let's look at the long term, all right? Okay, total enrollment. Since 1997 as a base year. Any lawsuits in 97? No complaints. Everybody was happy. 1997. Plus, that's the easy way to get the data from TEA. By the way, Texas collects more data than any other state. And in the quality data campaign, there are 10 attributes of your data that make you perfect. Texas has 9 of them. The one lacking is the teacher connection, the teacher link to student performance. Remember I talked about policies and politics? Okay? Policy is good to link the student outcomes to teachers. The politics has prevented it. Okay? And the previous commissioner promised the previous public ed chairman that he was going to do that. That hasn't been done. Okay, so there's your enrollment. There's your inflation. Okay? Where have the expenditures been since 97? About 116.5%. And the fund balances, oh, by the way, you thought Texas had a good rainy day fund? It's not as good as public ed. And, of course, the answer is they want to maintain a certain amount of surplus in case something happens. Now, the argument against that is you're talking to an entity that can tax you and send taxes and sell tax anticipation notes. And by the way, those of you that like bond referenda, Texas has been a fast grower. There's our bonds and our INS, interest in sinking. Okay, how am I doing on time, Randy? Okay, good. Okay, let's look at the spending. Again, spending, not the revenue. Look at the spending on staff. All right, this is total staff base pay per student. It shows how expenditures grew between 06 and 11. Okay, staff costs are about 80% of all expenditures. And beginning in 2012, the staff costs, as you can see, the staff costs, there's the cut. The staff costs return to the previous trend. And as you can see, that was unsustainable. See, I can do that there. Huh? Stereo. This is good. The increase in staff costs between 6 and 10 are much more significant change than the cuts in 2012 and 2013. And should we explore those costs, those increases in more depth? I don't think so. Now, how many people, where do you think Texas stands nationally in the percent of our expenditures that we spend on education? How many people think it's in the lower half? Percentage of all of our expenditures for education. How many people think it's the top 10? In yellow. There are only 2 states so does Texas have education as a priority? I would say so. And by the way, the quality counts that I think the judge or David mentioned about the 4 things. Quality counts has a survey, a performance report on where states go with their education, and the 4 qualifiers are poverty, parental education, employment, and language ability. Texas is in the bottom 3 in each of those categories, just because of our diverse and new population. But we move our kids higher from our base than any other state. So, now, what are our legislative solutions? I got 2 minutes. See, this is working out just right. What's going to happen? Again, we need to look at the conflict between good policies and politics. Cost of Education Index, I think Merle Haggard was a kid before that happened. Cost of Education Index is the first correction in the funding formulas. And it was designed to take care of any cost that a school district incurred that wasn't its fault. Like, was it a large school district? Was it urban, suburban, rural? Is it poor? Do the teachers in the next district get a whole lot more money? How much do they pay their teachers? Okay? And we haven't touched that. And oh, by the way, as an index, it ranges from 1.04 to 1.14 because it was condensed to get rid of the other factors and just look at teacher pay. And looking at that back during the cut, I found that the school districts were not using it and not paying based on their CEI. And because it's such a small range, there was a very small difference between like a Dallas and a Wells ISD, like within a couple of percentage points, which really took advantage, actually screwed the larger districts and the urban districts. And David Thompson's right. That's something that needs to be updated. And if we could change just one thing, it would be it. We need to look at, ASETAR is my favorite. ASETAR, additional state aid for tax reduction. The state told the school districts, especially the ones that raised most of their money by their local taxes, and we had them compress it by 1/3, and we promised that we would make that difference. We would make up the difference. Well, the Senate plan last time got rid of what they call target revenue, which was basically ASETAR. That's still a factor. Compensatory education, right now, that's at risk. There are 14 at-risk behaviors or histories of a student. You get 20% more of a basic allotment for that. But we pay it based on free or reduced lunch kids. And that's not one of the factors. Why do we do that? So we need to understand spending. It needs to be simpler. And the bottom line to all this, if you're looking at efficiency, you're looking at productivity, and we talked to some of the more productive, more efficient school districts. What would you like as a reward for your better performance? You know what they said? Less regulation. Less regulation. And David Thompson helped in that session on coming up with House Bill 400. Great policies about making it easier and quicker to fire or get rid of unproductive teachers. We got some of it to get rid of the pay plan, you know how many teachers, by the way, are on the minimum pay scale? Anybody have any idea? You know how many? Zero, okay? So, anyway, and that's my time. So we need to understand that, and I think this next year or two, we might get to that. And understand the trends, not just the quick biennium. As you can see, quick recovery and beyond, but that's what fuels the lawsuit. So we look at spending, look at results, look at what we get for our spending. Remember, it's not how much you spend, but it's how well you spend it. And here's my one thing, testing. Okay, we have an obesity problem. Let's get rid of all the scales. Testing is as much for the schools as it is for the kids. And you talk about policies and politics. The politics of getting rid of testing was all about the adults and all about accountability and all about my time is up. I'm sorry, Randy. Thank you.
The single largest tax benefit, I'm going to call it, or break, that most homeowners get is the local option homestead exemption, the 20% local option homestead exemption, particularly that schools, that over 200 districts give around the state. Why does the state in our funding formulas punish districts for giving property tax relief to homeowners? Do you think that's a good idea? That's the way our formulas work. You actually get punished if you give tax relief to your local homeowners. I think that's going to come up in the context of the state property tax claim. But I wish we would simply do the studies. We don't have to have more statutes to require more studies. We simply need to comply with the requirements and the expectations that we've had on the books, frankly, for decades. And I want to end with one last observation, just kind of a thought experiment. We made the cuts in 2011, and Rob, the total was $5.4 billion. It was $4 billion out of the foundation school program, $1.4 billion of grants and allotments, and you're right, those didn't go to every district. We made those cuts at the exact same time that we phased in all of the new accountability and testing regime without any idea what was going to happen. And we didn't even try to do any kind of analysis of what was going to happen. Would we do that with the highway department? I want everybody in this room to think about your trip home. You've got to cross the Brazos or the Colorado. Let's say we ordered the highway department to build a new bridge. And we did no studies of what it was going to cost to build that bridge.
We'd have a toll.
No, we're just not going to do a study. And we'll just pick a number. We'll say, here's X amount to build a bridge. Good luck with it. Oh, and by the way, we're going to say you have to use the cost manual from 1984 for all of your steel and concrete and everything else. Good luck. How many of you would want to drive on that bridge? That's functionally what we're doing in our schools. We're using formulas that in many cases are decades old. We've made no effort whatsoever to update them.
Justice Enoch, I think Mr. Thompson just made your efficiency case argument right there for you. You got any comment on what he just said?
I think we're two things. One is, I just stated the fact, Edgewood tried to kick the parents out, but it is true. The school districts respond to their communities. They do respond to their parents. My only point being that school districts have their issues that don't necessarily align with the parents' efforts to get more choice in where they can send their child to school.
Well, and real fast, in formulas and spending, okay, well, you still use that base year. Every year, we have spent more than inflation, enrollment growth, and change in demographics has dictated. In fact, the cumulative money over I think through 2011 from 97 was $70 billion above inflation enrollment growth. So if we'd used those Aggie manuals from '84, we probably would have saved some money. But we spent beyond it anyway, because the only understanding that the legislature has had about school funding is, well, let's just put more in it. And in terms of efficiency, we looked at some things right before the cuts. We said, well, how can we save money? And what we found is if you added one kid per class in the United States, you'd save $12 billion a year. And in Texas, it's $1.088 billion a year. And do you know what and of course, most parents are told that smaller classes are better. Read chapter 2 of David and Goliath, Malcolm Gladwell's latest book. In fact, Mr. Hanushek is quoted in that chapter and talks about the inflection line for making it much more difficult to teach a number of kids, and instruction received is about 29 kids. Texas has about a 17-to-1 overall student-teacher ratio. And we have a 22-to-1 in K through 4 that was arbitrarily put back when Merle Haggard had his second hit, I think.
You're probably right.
I think it was.
Probably right.
And so these are just things to ponder, and you could have taken care of all the cuts by adding one kid per class.
We have time for a couple of quick questions here, way back in the corner there.
Just thought I'd point out my well-educated friend looked up.
And let me say also, while she's getting the microphone, please make sure they're questions rather than speeches.
My well-educated friend looked up the Merle Haggard song.
Oh,
I
what
thought
was
you'd be
it?
interested to know it was Poncho and Lefty.
Poncho and
It
Lefty.
was his version of the.
I think those are the trends in Washington.
Okay, right here.
So one of the things I think a lot of people don't understand about school finance is how heavily dependent it is on locally levied property taxes. And if Judge Dietz's finding is upheld in any way, shape, or form by the Texas Supreme Court and the Robin Hood system is overturned, where does that leave us? You know, there's a lot, the wealthy school districts, many taxpayers don't realize, are actually subsidizing the less wealthy school districts through their property taxes. It seems like we have a little bit of a house of cards here, and so what is your thinking about what the Texas Supreme Court is going to do with this?
David, you represent
Yep.
both wealthy and poor school
Yeah, we
districts.
actually, our group's unusual because we represent both 41s and 42s. Another image, think about. Think about an iceberg. 10% of it sticks up above the water. That's recapture. 90% of it below the water. The part that really rips the guts out of a ship is the part below the water, not the part you can see. I think that's evidence of what's going on. All districts subsidize the state through local property taxes, and this is a point most people don't understand. If local values go up, a city, a county, a hospital district actually get more revenue to operate with. It doesn't work that way for schools. It doesn't matter if you're a 41 that is simply paying more recapture or if you're just a sci-fair. If your values go up and your taxpayers actually write a bigger check, that money doesn't go in your community to improve your schools. It is a hidden source of revenue for the state. The increase in values is a revenue source for general revenue, and that's actually true for all districts.
That's true.
I do expect on recapture, I don't expect the Supreme Court to order the elimination of recapture, but I do think the existence of recapture is evidence of a system that is very dependent.
David,
let me finish,
all right, go
Alan.
ahead.
That is very dependent, in fact, probably overly dependent on local property taxes. So, all right, Alan.
Randy,
And that's a problem because of Edgewood, which requires equalization. It's the state not really wanting to take everyone's money, except they're required by Edgewood 1 to equalize education funding because local tax effort does not produce the same amount of wealth.
Right.
So how do you fix that without just spending more money and then requiring, because you complain the state share goes down when values go up, that the state has to spend more and more? This is it's the problem created by Edgewood 1. How do you fix it?
I think all, and I want to be clear, it's not just Edgewood 1, it's every single Supreme Court has said there is a duty to equalize the system. Why? Because the duty is a statewide duty to all districts and all communities. I do think the issue is if you start with just if you look at the absolute highs and the absolute lows and say, gosh, we've just got to narrow this range, it leads to pulling down the top and or an expense to the state that's going to be hard. You can't lift all boats to the highest level. I think if you look carefully at what the Supreme Court has said, the Supreme Court says decide what your standards are. What is that general diffusion of knowledge? Equalize to your standards, and then it becomes a political question what happens above that level. I think we need to really step back and carefully look at actually what the Supreme Court has said the equalization requirement under the Constitution is.
I think we're about out of time, folks, and somebody came to get her bell. I would put one footnote on this case and just my own explanation mark on this round. This round is unlike any other round in school finance since 1989 on the first ruling, because we have the issue before the Supreme Court that I think they've been calling for 30 years. In Edgewood 1, the court said efficient means productive of results with little waste. They have repeated that citation in virtually every ruling since that original ruling. And for the first time in 30 years, they now have the issue of efficiency before the court, productive of results with little waste. So I'm anxious to see what they do.